Hey guys, I hope you had a good weekend. Today we're going to be finishing up chapter 16. Um, and if you look at your syllabus here, it looks like we are on track to possibly finish a few days before the last day of school. And if we do, so be it. As long as we get all of our material covered, that will be fine. The way that I'm looking at it right now, it looks like we're going to finish chapter 16 today, which of course is a little bit ahead of schedule. Then tomorrow we would go ahead and do chapter 14. We're just going to be looking at a few pages in chapter 14. And then on Wednesday we would start chapter 15. Then what I am planning on doing is on Thursday and Friday, I'm going to let you do this lab exercise 22 over the eye and vision, and that would get us through this week. Then next week, we would finish up chapter 15, we would do lab exercise 23, and we would do our last lab exam. And when I got to looking, I noticed that my last lab exam was supposed to include our dissection over the brain and eyeball, which we're not getting to do. So therefore, I probably should have just waited and put lab exercises 17 and 18 on our last lab practical exam. But since we've already had questions about lab exercises 17 and 18 on your lab exam last week, then our last lab exam, which will actually not be this week, but next week at the end of the week, will be over only lab exercises 22 and 23. And then the last week, because remember we're getting out May the 11th now as our last day. So our last week, which will be pretty much the first week in May, we will be doing our last lecture exam, which will be over chapters 14 through 16, and then we would have our final exam as well. So we would have a whole week there to where we could get our last lecture exam in as well as our final. And obviously it won't take you a whole week to do both of those, but what I thought I might do is go ahead and give you the lecture exam toward the beginning of the week, and then give you the final more along like maybe middle to end of the week. So that way maybe give you a day or two to actually go back and review and look at all the chapters that we've gone over, because the final will be over everything that we've talked about this semester. And so go back and give you some time to go back and look at all that stuff. So again, those are the plans for our last 3 weeks of school. Because pretty much that's where we are right now. We're in our last 3 weeks because we have 2 more weeks in April and then the first week in May. So please let me know if you have any questions. So again, today we're going to finish up with chapter 16. We're going to be looking at the kinds of neurons that we have in the ANS, as well as the kinds of receptors that we have in the ANS. And this can be a little bit confusing because we have the same terminology for both the neurons and the receptors. So what we're going to talk about first are the neurons themselves. Okay, remember these are the nerve cells. Nerve cells release neurotransmitters. If you remember, neurotransmitters are the chemical signals that are released by the neurons. And there are 2 or 3 basic neurotransmitters that neurons can release. Neurons can release acetylcholine, which we've called ACH. They can also release epinephrine and norepinephrine, okay? And again, epinephrine and norepinephrine are pretty much the same thing. They're adrenaline and noradrenaline. Generally, the epinephrine adrenaline has more of an effect than the norepinephrine noradrenaline does. I think they both do the same thing. They're just that the epinephrine has more of an effect than the norepinephrine does. So anyway, so when we look at the neurons in our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, okay, remember those are both branches of our autonomic nervous system, our ANS. Remember we said that all preganglionic neurons, doesn't matter if they're sympathetic or parasympathetic, they release acetylcholine, period. So all preganglionic neurons in the ANS are going to be releasing acetylcholine, and those that release acetylcholine are called cholinergic. Okay, so all preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, all of the preganglionic neurons, these are the ones that go to the ganglia, they are cholinergic. That means they release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. Also, all postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division of your nervous system are cholinergic. So all preganglionic neurons in the ANS are cholinergic. all postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division are also cholinergic, meaning they release acetylcholine. Okay, the other type that we have are adrenergic, or I should say it's not genic, it's just adrenergic. So cholinergic and adrenergic. I'm saying them wrong. These are kind of hard to pronounce. But anyway, so all preganglionic neurons in the ANS are cholinergic, and all postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system are also cholinergic. All postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division are adrenergic. This means they release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay? So again, all preganglionic neurons, no matter which division they're in, are cholinergic. Postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic are adrenergic. Postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic are cholinergic. So again, we've already talked about this before. If you watch the videos that I asked you to watch earlier this last week, the crash course videos, he even talked about that on there. He talked about how all of the preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. The postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic division release epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division release acetylcholine. So most of our all of our preganglionic are releasing acetylcholine, and then we also have acetylcholine being released by those postganglionic of the parasympathetic. The only ones that release epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to be the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division. Okay, so that's not too difficult to understand. I think that that's pretty easy to understand. But then we're going to get over here to the receptors. So again, what we've talked about here are the the neurons. The neurons, the nerve cells in the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, and what neurotransmitters they're releasing. Okay, now what we're going to look at are receptors for those neurotransmitters. So remember, these receptors are going to be the molecules on the cell membrane of cells that these neurotransmitters will bind to. So we're also going to be calling these receptors cholinergic and adrenergic. We're also going to be calling them by the same name, but what we're going to be talking about is which neurotransmitter binds to those receptors and what effects does it have. So when we're talking about these receptors, we're talking about receptors that could be on the receiving end of a neuron, like it could be receptors on the dendrites of a neuron. It could also be receptors on those effector organs, okay? So receptors on the skeletal muscle, receptors on the smooth muscle, receptors on the cardiac muscle, receptors on the glands. Okay, so we're looking at the receptors that receive these neurotransmitters and which of these neurotransmitters binds and what are they called and what effects does it have when that neurotransmitter binds to that receptor on that effector organ, on that target cell. So again, target cells, target organs, target tissues. Again, we're talking about skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And again, remember, mainly in this chapter, we talked about cardiac, smooth muscle, and glands. But remember, skeletal muscle also is going to have these receptors. And those neurotransmitters bind to those receptors on the skeletal muscle. So we can have cholinergic receptors. Okay, what does this mean? Well, obviously, cholinergic meant that acetylcholine. A cholinergic neuron is releasing acetylcholine. Okay, a cholinergic receptor is binding acetylcholine. This means acetylcholine sticks to it and it causes things to happen. Okay, so there are two different forms of cholinergic receptors that bind to acetylcholine. There are nicotinic and muscarinic. Nicotinic receptors are going to be on postganglionic neurons. Okay, so the dendrites of postganglionic neurons. Skeletal muscle also has nicotinic receptors that bind acetylcholine, and your adrenal glands also have nicotinic receptors that bind acetylcholine. Well, when acetylcholine binds to these nicotinic cholinergic receptors, it has excitatory effects. So what we're saying here, a nicotinic cholinergic receptor binds acetylcholine, and when acetylcholine binds, it excites that tissue, okay? It excites the skeletal muscles to contract, and we know that. When acetylcholine binds to that motor end plate of that skeletal muscle cell, the muscle contracts, okay? That's excitatory, okay? So again, those are nicotinic cholinergic receptors on that skeletal muscle because they are binding acetylcholine and it excites the skeletal muscle cell and causes it to contract. Also, postganglionic neurons, all of them, because remember, all of our preganglionic neurons are cholinergic. They're all releasing acetylcholine. So then this means that all receptors on our postganglionic neurons are going to be cholinergic because acetylcholine is binding to them. All preganglionic neurons are cholinergic. They're releasing acetylcholine. So all postganglionic receptors on those dendrites of those postganglionic neurons are cholinergic because they are binding acetylcholine. Okay, acetylcholine binds to them. And again, they're going to be, these cholinergic receptors are going to be nicotinic. Nicotinic meaning when the acetylcholine binds to that cholinergic receptor on that postganglionic neuron, it excites it. What does it excite it to do? It excites it to generate an action potential so then that postganglionic neuron can release neurotransmitter at its terminal end. And then again, our adrenal glands also have nicotinic cholinergic receptors, meaning that when acetylcholine binds to the receptors on those cells of that adrenal medulla, it excites that adrenal medulla. What does it excite those cells of the adrenal medulla to do? Well, we already know that. It excites them to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will then go into the bloodstream, travel throughout the body, and have widespread effects. Okay, so again, this is how our sympathetic nervous system is able to have widespread effects all over the body, because when that acetylcholine that's being released by that preganglionic, that sympathetic preganglionic neuron, which is cholinergic, it's releasing acetylcholine, that acetylcholine binds to these nicotinic cholinergic receptors and excites those cells, basically excites them, stimulates them to release the epinephrine and norepinephrine that then act as hormones. They go into the bloodstream, travel all over the body, and have widespread effects. The other type of cholinergic receptor is a muscarinic cholinergic receptor. What is muscarinic? Well, it can have an excitatory or an inhibitory effect. Okay, so remember, all nicotinic have excitatory effects. Muscarinic can have an excitatory effect or an inhibitory effect. It just depends upon, which tissue it's binding that has these receptors that are binding that acetylcholine. So again, our muscarinic cholinergic receptors are going to be found on all of our parasympathetic effectors. So all effector organs that are part of the parasympathetic nervous system are going to have muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Some sweat glands have muscarinic cholinergic receptors. And again, this means that when acetylcholine binds to them, it can be excitatory or inhibitory. It just depends upon the effector that we're talking about. An example here, when acetylcholine binds to a muscarinic receptor in the heart, in cardiac muscle, it causes the heart rate to decrease. But when acetylcholine binds to a muscarinic receptor in the smooth muscle of the stomach, it increases. It's excitatory. It increases the rate of the stomach contraction. So again, what was different? Both of these are muscarinic receptors. They're both binding acetylcholine, so they're cholinergic. The difference is whether it was excitatory or inhibitory. Well, what caused that? Well, it was the type of tissue. In the heart, when a muscarinic cholinergic receptor binds acetylcholine, it's inhibitory. It decreases the heart rate. Okay, so that's that parasympathetic effect. But when acetylcholine binds to the muscarinic receptors in the stomach, it has an excitatory effect. It causes it to contract. Again, you guys, these are parasympathetic effects. So in some cells, the muscarinic cholinergic receptor, when acetylcholine binds, it causes it to decrease its activity, like in our heart, slow our heart rate down. But in other tissues and other effector organs, when acetylcholine binds to this muscarinic cholinergic receptor, it speeds it up, such as causing the stomach to contract. So again, that's that rest and digest response caused by the parasympathetic nervous system. Slow down the heart, speed up the digestion. Okay? So again, muscarinic cholinergic receptors we find in all of our effector organs, all of our tissues that have these cholinergic receptors in the parasympathetic nervous system. They're all going to be muscarinic, meaning that sometimes when the ACH binds, it has an inhibitory effect. Sometimes when the ACH binds, it has an excitatory effect. Okay, so then let's look at the other types of receptors. Again, adrenergic. What is adrenergic? Well, an adrenergic neuron released epinephrine and norepinephrine. Well, an adrenergic receptor binds epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, so this means that these receptors, epinephrine and norepinephrine, will bind to them, stick to them. And Again, these adrenergic receptors are located on most of your sympathetic effectors, okay? So muscarinic cholinergic receptors are located on all of our receptors in our effector organs of our parasympathetic nervous system. But most effector organs in your sympathetic nervous system are going to be adrenergic, meaning that it's epinephrine and norepinephrine that binds to those receptors, and again, can be excitatory or inhibitory. Again, it depends upon which, in this case, it doesn't necessarily depend upon the type of tissue. It depends upon the type of adrenergic receptor, okay? And he did talk about this in one of those crash course videos as well. And again, as we said earlier, epinephrine has more of an effect than norepinephrine does. The epinephrine has a greater effect. They both have the same effect, but epi tends to have a greater effect than norepinephrine. Okay, so two types of adrenergic receptors are alpha and beta. And then you can go on in and have an alpha 1, beta 1, alpha 2, and beta 2. But basically, alpha and beta, if epinephrine, norepinephrine binds to one of these, and he talked about it in the video. I think it might have been if the epinephrine, norepinephrine is binding to the alpha, then it was excitatory. Or no, I think it was excitatory. And then if epinephrine and norepinephrine bind to the beta, then it was inhibitory. So I think if you go back and look at that crash course video, if you haven't watched it yet, he talks about this. Like when that epinephrine and norepinephrine is binding, the reason why it caused the heart rate to speed up and the digestion to slow down was because the heart cells had alpha receptors and the digestive organ had beta receptors. And so therefore, when the epinephrine binds to the alpha receptor, it speeded up the heart rate. But when epinephrine bound to the beta receptor on the digestive organs, it slowed them down. And again, that's that fight or flight response. Increase the heart rate, decrease the digestive organs, because you're not worried about eating or going to the bathroom when you're trying to survive some kind of stress or danger. So again, we see that these muscarinic cholinergic receptors are responsible for the varying reactions or the varying effects that the parasympathetic nervous system has on different organs, whereas it's the alpha and beta adrenergic receptors that are responsible for more of the excitatory and inhibitory effects that are caused by the sympathetic nervous system. Again, these adrenergic receptors can be stimulated in two ways: by the nervous system, because remember, we have neurons. We have these neurons that in this sympathetic nervous system, these adrenergic neurons that are releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. So again, those neurotransmitters being released by those neurons are going to be stimulating these receptors. But remember also, those preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system also stimulate the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So again, these receptors can be stimulated by epinephrine and norepinephrine that is being released from the adrenal medulla. Okay, so this is just kind of a review. This is showing us our nicotinic receptors, again, being released by all preganglionic not the nicotinic receptors, but the cholinergic neurons. Remember, all preganglionic neurons are releasing acetylcholine. So this means that all postganglionic neurons have nicotinic receptors. So every postganglionic neuron that we look at, we're going to look at three pictures here. They all have nicotinic receptors. The dendrites have nicotinic receptors because they all are receiving the acetylcholine that's being released by all preganglionic neurons, no matter whether they're sympathetic or parasympathetic. So all postganglionic neuron receptors are nicotinic. They are binding ACH and being excited. This generates an action potential in this postganglionic neuron. And then, again, it depends upon which postganglionic neuron we're looking at as to whether we are releasing acetylcholine or epinephrine or norepinephrine. Again, if it's parasympathetic, it's releasing acetylcholine. If it is sympathetic, it's releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. So we see here that this one is, if we have muscarinic receptors here, then this one is going to be parasympathetic. Okay, so this is a parasympathetic postganglionic neuron releasing acetylcholine, and we have muscarinic receptors here binding it, because it's the muscarinic receptors that you have on that parasympathetic, that you have muscarinic receptors on those parasympathetic effector organs. So if we have muscarinic receptors here, then this must be a parasympathetic effect, and this must be a parasympathetic postganglionic neuron. Okay, moving on then, here we have adrenergic. So again, this is smooth muscle. We can tell that. Again, here's our preganglionic neuron releasing. It is going to be cholinergic. It is releasing acetylcholine. These are going to be nicotinic because they are receiving acetylcholine. And again, because all postganglionic neurons have those nicotinic receptors that are binding acetylcholine and being excited. So here we see that this is going to be a nicotinic receptors. This is cholinergic, releasing acetylcholine binding here to these nicotinic receptors, these cholinergic nicotinic receptors. And then here, if this has adrenergic receptors, then that is going to be a sympathetic effector organ. So this is going to be, this could be smooth muscle in the digestive tract or something. And norepinephrine binding to this. And in this case, if this is sympathetic, what is going to happen when norepinephrine binds to these adrenergic receptors? Well, what's going to happen is, since this is sympathetic, we're going to have an inhibitory response. We're going to have digestion being slowed down. Okay, if this were cardiac muscle, obviously, how do I know this is smooth and not cardiac? Well, I can tell because we can see those fusiform cells there, those small, kind of tapered end fusiform cells. This is smooth muscle. So I know, well, if this is adrenergic receptors, I know this is a sympathetic effector. I know that this is norepinephrine being released, and it's going to be binding to the adrenergic receptors on this smooth muscle, and I know it's going to be inhibited because this is sympathetic. Norepinephrine is going to inhibit that smooth muscle, because that's what the sympathetic nervous system does. If this was cardiac muscle, then I know that this norepinephrine is going to have an excitatory effect. This norepinephrine is being released here by this sympathetic postganglionic neuron. That norepinephrine is going to bind to these adrenergic receptors, and it's going to stimulate. So again, these are probably, I think, the beta receptors, the beta adrenergic receptors on this smooth muscle, inhibitory effect. If it were the alpha, it would be an excitatory effect, and I won't swear to that. I know one's excitatory and one's beta. The one is excitatory and one's inhibitory, but I don't remember which one is which. But you can go back and look at that video and see. And I mean, I'm not going to ask you that on a test or anything, but. Okay, so looking at autonomic reflexes, again, when we look at autonomic reflexes, these are going to be different than like our spinal cord reflexes. We're not going to be looking at stimulating skeletal muscle here. We're going to be looking at stimulating and controlling the activity of our smooth muscle and our cardiac muscle and our glands. So again, it's going to be controlling the activity of visceral organs, glands, smooth muscle and blood vessels, cardiac muscle, things like that. So an example. You can have baroreceptors, which are sensory receptors in blood vessels that detect a change in blood pressure, okay? This sensory receptor will then send a signal along a sensory neuron in your glossopharyngeal and vagus cranial nerves, and that will go to the medulla oblongata. Interneurons in your medulla oblongata will process and integrate that information, okay? Again, that's part of the brain. And then it will that medulla oblongata, which is where that cardiac control center is located, will send a message back down an autonomic motor neuron to the heart, which is the effector organ, to change the heart rate, okay? Again, in this case, if your blood pressure is too high, then it's going to, slow the heart rate down. If it's too low, it's going to speed it up, whatever the case may be. So when you look at this, we see we have a sensory receptor, we have a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron, and an effector organ. So again, remember, those are the parts of a reflex arc. So in our autonomic nervous system, we have reflex arcs just like we have in our somatic nervous system, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. We need to understand that it is the hypothalamus that has the overall control of our autonomic nervous system. Just like we have reflex, like that cardiac control center, we have reflex centers in our brain, in our brain stem, specifically in our brain stem, because that's where all of our vital life processes are going to be, controlled or affected. and also in our spinal cord, but it's not those parts that are controlling everything. It's the hypothalamus that has the overall control of all these vital life processes. In general, if the posterior hypothalamus is stimulated, then it's going to produce the sympathetic responses. It's basically the hypothalamus will stimulate the correct reflex centers, the correct control centers in the brain to give us those sympathetic responses. And if the anterior hypothalamus is stimulated, then that hypothalamus will stimulate the correct reflex centers in the brain to give us those parasympathetic reflex responses. So again, posterior hypothalamus gives us our sympathetic responses in general, and anterior hypothalamus in general gives us our parasympathetic responses. And again, the hypothalamus is stimulated first, and then it has connections with other parts of the brain, and it stimulates, the other parts of the brain to do their thing. The hypothalamus also has connections with the cerebrum and the limbic system, which, remember, the limbic system plays an important role in emotions. So the hypothalamus is able to process and integrate thoughts and emotions to produce certain autonomic nervous system responses. For example, if you are thinking about something delicious that you love to eat, your mouth might start watering. Okay, your mouth starts watering. Your secretions of your salivary glands increase. Also, glands in your stomach will start secreting more of those secretions. Again, preparing to eat that food and start digesting it, and that's a parasympathetic response. Again, so the hypothalamus, when you just think of this delicious meal, your hypothalamus starts preparing your body by stimulating the secretion of glands in your digestive organs, your mouth, your stomach, your intestines, your pancreas, to go ahead and start preparing your body for this. And all you're doing is thinking about it. You're not actually even eating it yet. And again, it's able to do this because that hypothalamus is part of the limbic system. And so it's able to stimulate those responses. On the other hand, if you're angry, then your blood pressure increases. Your heart rate increases, and this is because your blood vessels are going to constrict. Why does this happen? Again, just that emotion. Again, we're talking about emotions here. The hypothalamus is part of the limbic system, and so that when you feel that emotion, that hypothalamus, stimulates this sympathetic response of blood vessel constriction, which causes increased heart rate and increased blood pressure just from an emotion. So it doesn't have to be a physical activity, just a thought can cause these things to happen, because the hypothalamus is connected to it's part of the emotional centers of your brain. It's part of that limbic system. Okay, autonomic reflexes. Generally, the autonomic reflexes, such as that on our heart rate, is done through the vagus nerve. When we're talking about parasympathetic response, like lowering the heart rate, that is going to be done along the vagus nerve. A sympathetic response, like causing the heart rate to accelerate, is going to be done along specifically the specific sympathetic nerve that we're talking about here is called the cardiac accelerator or cardiac accelerator nerves. But basically, it's a sympathetic nerve, and that causes the heart rate to increase. So again, we have two different nerves causing two different effects on the heart, depending upon the environment, your emotions, the physical situation, whether you're exercising or resting. Again, those different responses are being carried from the hypothalamus, from the hypothalamus to the medulla oblongata, and from the medulla oblongata to the heart to cause those responses by two different nerves. The parasympathetic nerve is the vagus nerve. The sympathetic nerve, is specifically cardiac accelerator nerves, which you don't have to know that. That's just one example. Okay, we also have autonomic and local reflexes in our enteric nervous system. Remember, the enteric nervous system is the system that regulates the activity of our digestive organs. You have sensory neurons in these enteric plexuses that supply the brain and spinal cord with information, and then autonomic motor neurons also in those enteric plexuses are going to carry the information from the brain and spinal cord down to the smooth muscle of the digestive organs, as well as the glands in those organs, to get that response. So again, those are the autonomic reflexes. It's kind of the same kind of process here. You go from the sensory receptor to the sensory neuron to the interneuron in the brain and spinal cord, back down a motor neuron to affect the effector organs, the smooth muscle and glands of the digestive organs. So that's your autonomic, kind of same like reflex like we just talked about right here. Kind of the same sort of thing. But we also have local reflexes in our enteric nervous system. A local reflex does not involve the central nervous system. So the information never goes to the brain. It never goes to an interneuron. It's kind of like what do we call it? The reflex, the knee-jerk reflex. The knee-jerk reflex. But we called it something else, I think. Maybe it was a stretch reflex is what we called it. That it was the simplest one. It did not involve an interneuron. So that's kind of like what we're looking at here, the local reflex of the enteric nervous system. It does not involve the central nervous system. It doesn't go up from a sensory neuron to an interneuron in the brain and spinal cord and then back down a motor neuron. Basically, it produces involuntary, unconscious responses to stimuli in our digestive organs. Remember that our visceral smooth muscle, a lot of it is automatic. It has those pacemaker cells, kind of like the cardiac muscle, and it's rhythmic, and it's kind of automatic, and it does its own thing, and your brain is not involved in it. For example, when the walls of the digestive tract are stretched, okay, you eat, okay? And this starts, you guys, as soon as you start swallowing your food. You stretch the smooth muscle in that esophagus, and that you don't even have any information that has to go to the brain. As soon as that stretching happens, those receptors detect that, and they start causing that smooth muscle all along the walls of your digestive tract, all along your digestive tract to start contracting. And you don't notice it maybe as much when you are older, but think about a baby. As soon as a baby eats, just almost as fast as a baby eats, it poops. It goes to the bathroom, it poops. Okay, this is because of this local reflex in this enteric nervous system. As soon as that baby starts swallowing, stretching the walls of that esophagus, stretching the walls of the stomach as the stomach fills up with food, the information doesn't have to go to the brain and then come back down to tell the rest of the digestive organs to start contracting. They just start contracting automatically. And when those digestive organs start contracting, then that starts pushing material forward. So it comes out the other end. Okay. Now, as older people, we're able to hold it. So oftentimes, we can eat, but we don't have to go to the bathroom right away. But a lot of times also, if you eat a lot and get your stomach really full, where you've really stretched the walls of that stomach, then you feel like you've got to go to the bathroom too. So, I mean, you can see it in your own life personally, but it's definitely obvious in a baby. And again, this is due to the fact that these are local reflexes that are happening in that digestive tract. As soon as those stretch receptors and those smooth muscles in the digestive tract start being stimulated, okay, those are sensory receptors. Then sensory neurons in these plexuses send information directly to motor neurons, no interneuron in the brain involved, and start causing that smooth muscle to contract, to start moving that material through. Because when you're putting new in, you're going to have to get some out. You're going to have to put some out to make room. Okay, so some generalizations about the autonomic nervous system that we need to remember. One division is not always excitatory and the other always inhibitory. Both can have either excitatory or inhibitory effects. Again, go back and look at our cholinergic and adrenergic receptors. Those muscarinic adrenergic receptors, those muscarinic cholinergic receptors, and then those alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. Remember, those muscarinic those are parasympathetic, can be excitatory or inhibitory. Those adrenergic, alpha and beta, can be excitatory or inhibitory for the sympathetic nervous system. So again, you have both excitatory and inhibitory effects being produced by both systems. Another thing we need to remember, we have dual innervation. Most organs, not all, but most of them are dually innervated, meaning that they have nerves running to them that are both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And so usually when an organ is dually innervated, meaning that it is innervated by both divisions, both the parasympathetic and sympathetic, usually the two divisions have an opposite effect. One will be excitatory, the other will be inhibitory. Okay? So again, for example, we don't get to do that, do we? For example, like we talked earlier with your heart, okay? The sympathetic nervous system speeds it up, the parasympathetic slows it down. So again, the heart is dually innervated. It is innervated by both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. And so usually when that's true, one is excitatory, the other is inhibitory. They have opposite effects. Either division alone can coordinate activities of different structures. So, for example, parasympathetic control of digestion increases the secretion of glands, while sympathetic control decreases the secretion of glands. So, again, either division alone can work alone. However, sometimes both divisions are needed to get something to happen. And a good example there, and he also talked about this on one of the crash course videos, was having sex. Okay? In order to get an erection, you have to have parasympathetic stimulation, but in order to get ejaculation, you have to have sympathetic stimulation. Okay? So, again, the same is true both in men and women. Having sex involves both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. So, again, either division can work alone to get something done that needs to be done, but sometimes both divisions are necessary in order for you to do something. And again, remember, we've talked about this more than once. The effects of the autonomic nervous system may be general, which means widespread throughout the body, or local, meaning altering activity of specific structures in just one body region. Remember, generally, sympathetic effects are more widespread because those splanchnic nerves are going to be innervating that adrenal medulla to release that epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are then released into the bloodstream and go act as hormones and go all over the body. So generally, the sympathetic nervous system has more widespread effects all over the body, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system has more local effects, means that it can just affect structures in one area of the body rather than affecting the whole body, because the parasympathetic doesn't stimulate the release of any hormones that travel in the bloodstream all over the body. So in general, parasympathetic effects are much more local, whereas sympathetic effects are more widespread throughout your body. Okay, and that will be it for Chapter 16. Please let me know if you have any questions. We will be having a quiz over Chapter 16 tomorrow, and we will be talking about Chapter 14. I hope you have a great Monday and a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.